Hey folks, my name is Levi Fredrickson. I'm the Applicant Experience Specialist at Oregon Tilth, which is a fancy way of saying I get to work on the front lines with folks like yourselves that are applying for organic certification or some of the other certifications that Oregon Tilth offers. I'm really fortunate to be in this chair where I get to work with a team that serves a lot of you folks and help you through the application process to develop what's called an Organic System Plan, or OSP for short. So we get a lot of calls from folks who say something to the effect of, can I get a consultant to fill this out for me? Do you guys have some sort of webinar, tutorial, something like that? And, for years the answer's been, well, just work with my team for free on the front lines and we'll be happy to help you. And after about 5 years or something, it's finally dawned on me, it may be useful to have a recorded tool you can watch in your own time after a hard day in the fields. Hopefully just, sit down with the OSP when you have some quiet time and work through the application along with this video. So the whole point of this is not just to make my job easier. The point is for you to have a resource where you can see someone who's familiar with the Organic System Plan, in other words, the Oregon Tilth application, walk through each section of it as it applies to you and address some of the major questions that come up. Now, I won't be able to exhaustively go through every piece, nor do we need to here, because if there's parts left, unexplored that you need to talk to us about, please get a hold of my team at getcertified@tilth.org, and we'll be glad to answer any questions or talk to you further about that part of the application and, make sure that you get your application in shape for an efficient review, because we want you to be able to get to organic certification on a timeline that meets your farm's goals for the year. So in that effort, I want to walk through all the forms for the crops OSP here. We will later, at some point, do one for livestock and one for handling or processing. But for now, we're going to do the crops OSP. And we'll go form by form and just address some of the really key points. And you can, stop at points, you can go back, because I'm going to have to move kind of quickly. But I'll give some examples here and there and talk about the major points of the crop OSP. So without further ado, let's start at the beginning. This folder that you see in front of you there is the crop application. So we have everything from C1 to C12 are the most pertinent forms. But in your application packet that you got from us by email, and by the way, if you don't have one, I encourage you to reach out to my team, again, at that getcertified@tilth.org email address, and we'll be able to provide you with the most recent form of our application packet. So please don't use one that's 5 years old. We may not be able to accept it. It's always heartbreaking to tell someone who worked hard on forms that they got from their neighbor that are outdated. We really need updated forms. So please be sure your forms are only a year or two old, and those dates are at the bottom of the form. You can see when it was produced. Maybe it's 2 years old, but just check with us to be sure you have the most recent version. All right, so the place to start is always the checklist, C1, C for crop. So I'm going to open the checklist, and I go through it here. Let me make myself a little smaller, folks. That's better. No one needs to see my ugly mug there. So on C1, we have all the check boxes, and these activities on the left column are saying, all right, I'm doing these things, and therefore on the right column, then these are the forms that apply. So if I go down this, I'm going to say, I'm applying for Oregon Tilth Organic Certification for crop. Yes, that's why I'm here. I check that, I'll do the O1 operation information required. Now, for some reason, a lot of folks miss this one, I think because it's not a C in front of it, so they see an O and think it does not apply. This form goes quickly, but it's really important because this serves as your certification contract with Oregon Tilth. And it helps us know who are the key contacts for us to be in touch with for primary contact, legal contact. So it's a really important form. Everyone has to do it that's applying. And I'll go through that with you. Then the remaining ones, I grow crops. So if I look out the window and say I'm doing orchard crops and some diversified vegetables, yeah, that applies to me. This is most, but not all, of our crop growers, all right? For those of you who do pasture, so you're growing hay or something like that, this is going to apply for you, okay? Some folks wonder if having pasture or something would apply. Now there's a few cases this would not apply, maybe if you're just doing fallow or something like that and you're not growing crops at the time, but almost everyone doing crop certification would check this and thus do C2, 4, 5, 6, and 12. There's a couple specialized cases here: aquaponics, containers, greenhouse, which by the way means you're growing crops in a greenhouse to be sold as greenhouse crops. It does not apply to folks who have a simple hoop house for season extension. It's actually greenhouse crops. So if that applies to you, or if you're wondering that applies, you can always get a hold of us and see if you need to fill out A1. Wild crops, that's folks who are harvesting Oregon grape for tinctures, chanterelle mushrooms out in the woods, things like that. So if you think, ginseng's another common one. If you probably know if that applies to you or not. The rest of them are basically the C forms, essentially. And I'll go down and say real quick with C13 and C14, almost none of you watching this video are going to complete those, so save yourself trouble. If you think that you're a multi-site grower cooperative, such as, well, there's a bunch of apple growers, and we all have our own farms, but we have an internal control system that was auditing all of us. Like, if you're a true cooperative, this might apply, but please get a hold of us before you fill it out. Same with C14. If you're an incubator farm, we have a few examples, but you almost always know who you are. Just want to save you the hassle because those are in the application, but they rarely apply to a lot of our applicants. All right. Now let's, like I said, start with the O1 operation information. So I'm going to open that here. It's really important, folks, that you put the operation name as your legal entity. In other words, how do I pay taxes for the farm? So if I pay taxes as Levi Fredrickson, but the farm is affectionately called Watermelon Sugar Farm, okay, say that's my farm name, but it's not a legal entity. I just pay under my own name or me and my wife's name or something like that. That's what I'm going to put up there is Levi Fredrickson, DBA, doing business as Watermelon Sugar Farm. Now, if Watermelon Sugar Farm is registered as an LLC with the state of Oregon or state of Wyoming, wherever you live, state of Delaware is really common, then you can put Watermelon Sugar Farm, LLC, and you would not have to put your own name up here. It's just however you pay taxes, and then you can have any number of DBA or fictitious name as long as you're following state requirements around that, okay? You cannot have two different taxable entities up there. So ABC Farms, Inc., and XYZ Farms LLC cannot be on the same certificate per USDA National Organic Program or NOP guidelines. All right, so just one legal name. I didn't mean to harp on that so long, but it comes up a lot. Oh, this one, expedited services, folks. I'll just be crystal clear. At the time of this recording, expedited services cost a really considerable $3,000. I know that's a chunk of change. I don't have that myself. There are farms where they absolutely need to have expedited services in order to get to certification as fast as possible. We're happy to do that if you need that. We have to use $3,000 to secure additional staff resources in order to make that happen on an expedited timeline. Everything from inspection, which by the way, there will still be an inspection fee, okay? But the inspection, the initial review, final review, all of that, every step of the process will be faster with expedite. How much faster depends on the time of year, a lot of things, okay? It's tough to say. Get a hold of us to talk about that on the phone because what I say now might not apply in 3 months. It probably won't. When do you anticipate the need for certification? This is basically like a lot of folks will put their first potential date of harvest in. So if I'm thinking I'm gonna, harvest my hazelnuts on October 1st, then I would put October 1st as I'd want to have them ideally certified by the time I harvest, so I know I can sell them right off the farm or through whatever avenue you're using. We'll always try to work with you and ensure those dates are met, but if you get a hold of us a week before you have to harvest, it's going to be next to impossible to get a review done and an inspector scheduled and out there on time. So, we will consider this date, but there's only so much we can do. The best thing you can do is apply 3, 4, 6, 12 months in advance, okay? Anything up to 9 to 12 months in advance is plenty of notice. 3 to 4 months is getting down to the, comfortable zone. We hate to have nail biter situations. where you're waiting around for inspection, the rains are coming, the crop is getting powdery mildew. So we encourage you to apply soon in the year before your first harvest rather than right up to the time to cut. All right. And then a couple of questions about, is it a legally registered business? Hopefully so. If it's not, we can talk about it. Are you doing organic product only with this legal entity, or are you going to do some non-organic and some organic? It's fine to do both. Requires a little more record keeping. We'll talk about that later. If you have DBAs or fictitious names, similar, you can put those in here, and we'll gladly add them to your certificate as long as they are actually DBAs. Some states require you to register doing business as or fictitious names. Some states do not. Just check with your Secretary of State on the requirements. All right, the mailing address. So we have 3 different contexts here: billing, mailing, and location of inspection. It's really important to have these as clear as possible with the address, city and state. Your physical address that is going to be inspected has to be a physical address. It can't be a P.O. box because we can't inspect a P.O. box, okay? So this has to be where the inspector will come. And if you say, well, there's no real address for that field, it's just kind of between field A and B, that's fine. Just give us the best coordinates you can, or somewhere that your inspector can meet you and travel to that site, all right? Now going down to legally responsible contact, this should be someone that, you know, has their name perhaps registered with the state, has some legal stake in the business, all right? It's fine if the legal contact and the primary billing are all the same person, okay? And the legal contact does not have to get any communication from us if they do not want. So they can just serve as legal contact and they never have to hear from us again if they don't want to. However, the primary contact, this is really important. This person should be able to regularly check their emails, or if you're not using email, that's fine. Regularly check the post office box or your mail at home. Or if not using those, you regularly listen to their voicemails or phone calls. We have to be able to get a hold of this person. Unfortunately, I've seen primary contacts designated that maybe went on vacation or just don't really want to look at emails, and I get that feeling. But we have to be able to get a hold of you because we'll say, hey, we need more information to complete your review. So make sure it's someone who is up to the challenge. All right. And you can designate other additional contacts and say, please CC this person on any emails, and we'll do that. Gladly work with you. And if you need more contacts in your farm. All this is to say everyone who's a contact can make changes to your OSP as long as you say that's allowable. So we'll assume if they're on here, they can make changes, they can get a hold of us and ask about the file. If you have a consultant, you may want to list your consultant on here. If you do not list someone on here and they call us and say, well, I want to add an input or I want to add a crop and their name's not on here, we can't really tell them anything about the file, and that's to protect your confidentiality. So just be sure that everyone on here is the people, the parties on your farm business that you want to be able to make changes. Going on, for most folks watching this video today, you would check crop here. You may check wild crop. If you have transitional land that has not yet, met the eligibility date for organic, which we'll talk about later on the C2 section, but 3 years since the last prohibited substance, you may have land that's in transition to organic, so that could apply to you. Almost no one watching today would check restaurant, retail, probably no one. A couple of mushroom growers may check fungi here, okay? Wild crop, there's a couple of you out there that might be doing ginseng or something cool in the woods. Handling distribution, that may apply to some of our farms. If you're doing some services like seed cleaning, or you're making jams and jellies on the farm when you're bringing vinegar in and other off-farm ingredients to make value-added products, you may need handling certification, but be aware just checking the box for that is not enough. You'll need to complete a whole separate handling OSP. And again, I'll happily do that video walkthrough later. All right, and then almost everyone is just going to check USDA NOP organic, because that's the organic seal that probably you're hoping to get in the end here. Oh, and there's a couple other certifications if you have questions on them. I mean, maybe you're exporting to the EU or Mexico. Maybe you want Salmon Safe or Be Better, some of these wonderful certifications that are outside of just straight organic certification. get a hold of us to talk about those. I don't really have time on this video to go into them. Now, for this, receive the applicable standards and reviewed them. This is really important. We happily provide you with them as part of your journey, your applicant journey at TILF. So there should be a link in your email. And the procedures manual and our fee schedule also linked in your welcome email that you got the crops application with. If there's other regulatory agencies, maybe, the FDA or someone, state of Wisconsin, something like that, come in and inspect your operation, it's good to know about them here. It probably will not make or break anything, but it's helpful to know that you have those inspections. And then it's good to know about any negative scoring from some of those FDA or State Department of Health or something. That doesn't disqualify you from organic certification, but it's better we're aware about it up front than find out about it later. I'll just say that. For those of you who've ever been certified organic before, it's really helpful if you fill this out. We'll find out if you were certified organic when you apply, because we can easily look that up. So again, it's best to know about it now. This might be a feather in your cap, or if you have some old non-compliance issues that need to be resolved, it's better we know about them up front, and we will help you navigate them. So you can, if you were suspended, we can help you get reinstated. For those of you that just brand new and never been certified, you can just simply mark no and move on. All right, attention all folks from California. This is really important, and some folks glaze over it, but if you're located in California, if you're selling organic product or growing organic crops there, you're going to need to satisfy California's unique state requirements. And you'll very likely, everyone watching this video would apply to CDFA for organic registration in the state of California. It's simple, it's relatively cheap, but we do need that completed before we can issue an organic certificate. And ideally have that completed before you even apply to TILF, okay? So we'll need to see that you're registered, and that takes some time, so please get on that. If you need information about how to get to California State organic registration, just get a hold of my team and we'll help you out. There's some fee stuff here. For the most part, at the time of recording here, our crops producers are going to plan on paying $625 for certification, and the only other fee in the first year is the inspection fee. We can tell you about what those ranges are when we talk to you on the phone or email if you're curious. But then there's some opportunities, talks about below, for production partnerships. Some of our folks, like Organic Valley, the co-op that does wonderful dairy products. Organic Valley has production partners that are dairies, so they work with them to kind of cover some of the fees. You can get a hold of a production partner if that applies for you. That's not everyone, certainly. And then a couple other pieces about membership to Oregon TILF and any feedback. We do read every word of this, by the way, so if you have either positive or constructive feedback, we value it greatly and will happily read it, you guys. Finally, super important, super simple. If you sign this little box down here, I can actually go in and sign this legally by going Levi, Fredrickson. So put your name there. This is acceptable if I check this box allowing for electronic signatures, okay? Then I'll put my name and my title and date. But be sure to put that on the signature line. You can also wet sign it, if you print it out, that's great. But we do need that completed before we can move forward, because this is your contract for certification. All right, that is the 01. And now I'm going to transition a little to talking about the crops application starting at C2. All right, going on to C2. This is sort of the fundamental of where we start with organic certification. And when I talk to a lot of you folks on the phone, one of the first questions I'll ask is, well, do you know the history of the land? Has it been free of prohibited substances, things like glyphosate or Roundup, Crossbow, any sort of commercial fertilizers, crystallized blue fertilizer like urea, ammonia, nitrate, or something like that. So those are prohibited substances. If that has been applied in the past 3 years, there may still be some options for transitional certification. We can talk about it. But the whole point of this land history form is to confirm the land history as well as you know it, okay? So we'll start at the beginning here. We always, at the top of these forms, put the name of the farm or operation. That'll help us refer to it easily. And as I scroll down, parcel name. You can give it any fun name you like, or you can be real legal eagle and write something like the township. And there's a place down here for section, township range. Some people put something like the coordinates in there, but this is basically just a simple name for you to refer to when you get a hold of Tilth and say, I want to update Cliff's hayfield because I'm going to put some new, pyrethrin on it or something like that. So we'll know exactly which parcel you're talking about. And then the address, we recognize fully that some crop fields don't have an address. So, as best you can. There's some instructions here. If it does not have an address, provide some sort of way for us to find it, because a lot of this is so your inspector can actually find the area or your team at Tilth can look it up. So as best you can, you fill it out. Now, let me be clear. I should have backed up and said the C2 you would fill out for each distinct parcel that you have. Some farms are like, well, we're 10 acres and that's our whole area. We have kind of 4 different fields within our orchard, and one block is apples, one's pears, but they're all managed about the same. That may be a case where you can put everything on one C2. But if you're one of those farms, pretty common with row crops where you have 100 acres over here and 100 acres a quarter mile away and 100 acres in another county, you'll very likely want to fill out a C2 for each of those distinct parcels. One question we like to encourage people to ask is, can I walk easily, quickly in between them? Are they contiguous? If they're only separated by a fence or a small road, you could probably still treat them the same, provided that their land history is all still the same. If I have one parcel here of 10 acres and I have another one over here and they're touching, I can walk between them, but one of them was sprayed in 2021 with, synthetic fungicide, and the other one was sprayed in 2018. Those are 2 different land histories. So in that particular case, you might need to fill out 2 different C2s. Now, if they're sprayed back in, the 90s or something like that, we might be able to treat them the same because it's been so long and they're not right on the line for certification. They're both eligible for organic. Okay. So moving forward, as we look at when did you begin managing this parcel, that's pretty important because we have folks who began leasing a parcel and they got management control 2 years ago. They maybe have been managing it since they bought the land for 20 years. Maybe they've been managing it for generations. Whatever it is, when do you have a reasonable understanding of what was applied to the land? So you put that date in there. We have a lot of people who transition from one certifier to Oregon Tilth. And is the parcel in question currently certified? If it is, please include an organic certificate, and that may save you having to do a lot of this stuff, okay? So instead of doing a C2, if you're already certified organic, you can just include a current organic certificate that includes this acreage. But it has to be the same acreage. So if it's 20 acres with your current certifier, it's got to be 20 acres here. You can't say, well, I suddenly added 40 acres this year, because then the acreage wouldn't match up and we'd still have to inspect the new part of the acreage. All right, going back, for those of us that this is new to, when do you plan on harvesting a certified organic crop from this parcel? This is really important. We want to see how close harvest is. If it's next week, we probably will not be able to inspect it in time before harvest, and thus this crop may not be eligible this year. If it's even next month, it'll be tight. So get a hold of us if you're in that circumstance. If you're applying well ahead of time and you have 3-4 months or something or more, that's wonderful, before you actually have to harvest. We will always look at this date of harvest and do everything we can on our end to make it out there, our inspectors, before you have to cut. Okay? If it happens that we're not able to get through initial review in time because there's some hangups for compliance, then we may not be able to inspect it. But this still helps us understand. Just to be crystal clear, if you harvest a crop and, something like swathing, or if you cut a crop is one way to think about it, before the inspection takes place and you're new to organic, that crop is not going to be eligible for organic that year, okay? Even if you take a video of it or something like that, it's not eligible per USDA National Organic Program guidance. All right. Now this table is, what are your crops on this acreage? Say it's 10 acres or something like that, approximate acreage for each crop, pears, apples, kiwi. And some of our folks are doing, diversified vegetables, and acres would not apply. You're talking about square feet. So you say, I've got 50-foot rows at 4 foot wide each. So, you can do the math there. By the way, this is a good time to clarify. Your organic system plan is very much a plan. It's not a rigid, protocol of this is exactly how we will do it, because we know really well farming is highly dynamic and has to change based on markets, weather, a million different things. So this is your plan going forward for the year, and we'll work with you to change the plan as needed. So if you say, I'm going to plant pumpkins, then the buyer for pumpkins, flakes out or something, and you have to plant zucchini instead, that's totally fine to alter your plans. Just let us know about it. Okay, but this is your, rough plan as it stands when you fill out the application. Now, boundaries, buffers. I love this one because I get a lot of questions on boundaries and buffers. And my team always responds to these questions about how big should a buffer be? And by the way, for anyone that's not familiar, a buffer is, this area between your certified organic land, okay, and then neighboring land, whether that's your neighbors and they're farming conventionally or organic will want to know about what they're doing, just roughly. If it's woodland or wildland or pasture, maybe it's forestry land. There's certainly some concerns in terms of organic compliance when you're butting up against forestry land. I'm not saying they're insurmountable concerns. We have a lot of clients who do that, but whatever it is, we want to know about, okay, what's going on at the neighbors, so to speak. And so you can show us where your borders are, roughly, and what's going on at the neighbors in this type of adjoining land use. And then how big are you going to make the buffers? And the way to answer the question of how big should I make my buffers is very simple. You want them sufficient to prevent contamination. Okay, that's the marvelous words in use by the National Organic Program. And the idea is, if you know that your neighbor is an orchard and that orchard is using a big air blast sprayer, that's going to throw a lot of stuff around. So it's very likely an air blast sprayer is going to go about 30, 50 feet perhaps, especially if there's a little wind. And so it may then get onto your crop if your crops are budding up, within 20, 30 feet of that. If you allow a buffer and say, all right, I'm going to be sure not to crop within 50 feet of that, or if I do have crops there already, especially with perennial crops, hazelnuts or something, that outer row will always be sold as conventional. You say it's a sacrifice row or it's a buffer row that will be harvested and sold as conventional. That is how big you want to have your buffer if you have something like an air blast sprayer, high potential for contamination. If it's something where your neighbor is on an ATV and they're spot spraying with a tank, and they've got their wand out there and the most it ever drifts is like 5 feet, then a 10-foot buffer might be sufficient. But you just want to ensure, and we want to see you have enough of a buffer that you will not get prohibited substances on your crops. Because if you get those substances on your crops and you harvest them and it all gets mixed together from the combine or whatever it may be in the picking bins, in the totes, it will be really hard to separate it after the fact, and you may have to end up selling the whole crop as conventional at that point. And certainly organic certifiers do test if they feel like there may have been a contamination event. So they'll test for a panel of some of these prohibited compounds. And so again, this is all to protect you. And that's the point. We'll work with you if you're not sure how to leave enough of a buffer. Or, with the activities of your neighbor. If you say, well, I don't speak to my neighbor because it's my brother and we had a falling out or something, that's a more common story than you may think. Whatever the reason, we can identify a buffer whether or not we actually know exactly what's going on next door. Now, this one, a lot of folks in all their excitement kind of glaze over 2.3, the maps. They're ultra important. We need to see a map for everyone. They're a lot simpler than you might think. So please do stop at this section and actually draw the map out because it will help you on the rest of the application. The map, as long as you check these boxes, okay, if you have everything in these check boxes, it will be an acceptable map and you will, at least through this part of your initial review with us, you'll coast right through. Your team will say, great, they did everything. If you're missing some of these that are important, it will slow review down a little because your team at Tilth will have to get a hold of you and say, can you put indication of north on there or whatever it might be that you missed. So this is just friendly insider encouragement. Try to check all these boxes where they apply. Maybe some of these don't apply to your land, but if any of these apply, you'll definitely want to have them on there in order to keep moving efficiently through review. And you can hand draw your map. We've seen some really cool artistic hand-drawn maps. You can use Google Maps and kind of put stuff over it where it's pertinent. You can use boxes or whatever. You could do county supplied maps that have township and range and all that. Any sort of bird's eye view of the property where we can get a clear idea of where your organic land will start and end and what's going on in the adjacent fields, okay? Now the history of the land is pretty important, going back at least 3 years. So we're saying what's going on in your current year, what about last year and the years prior. So we might go to 2023, so we'd go back to 2020 and list what crops roughly were being grown. And you might say, why does that matter? Well, we want to make sure that they were not GMOs, and it's okay if they are, but if it's GMO alfalfa is a really good example. There may be regrowth of the GMO alfalfa. That would be problematic if you were going to grow organic alfalfa. Okay, that's a pretty good example of where we really want to know about the prior crops. Now, just having GMOs grown 2 years ago will not restart your land history in the way that applying a prohibited substance like glyphosate would. However, we still would need to know that there were GMOs grown there and make sure you were doing some rotation, or if it was a GMO that had been completely obliterated, that there wasn't regrowth of it that might contaminate your organic crop. Okay. And roughly, we'd like to know about some of the materials you applied in the past. This example here is chicken manure that they generated on farm. Of course, that's not going to create a problem. But if you got, say, some witch's brew from the neighbor up the road where they swore it worked well for powdery mildew, and we'd want to know what was in that. Or if you got something off the shelf that was not OMRI listed, if it's not OMRI listed, we'd want to ensure that it was compliant before we certified you, and then later to find out, this is a prohibited substance. So we'll look back at the stuff and discuss it with you. If you have any questions, get a hold of us, because it might save you a lot of work on the application. Maybe you applied something prohibited and didn't know it, and we're here to help you through that stuff. Finally, last part of the land history here is the ever important affirmation. Now, this allows us, in the case where you have not managed the land 3 years or more, this allows us to go back to previous landowners or land managers and get some sort of confirmation from them. They'll actually sign here, and they will tell us the dates they managed. And if it was last year that someone else was managing this land and they are certain they did not apply anything prohibited, they can put those dates in and they sign on this. Now, please, please, please get a wet signature, meaning have them sign with a pen on this. We cannot accept them simply typing their name in, or you can't type their name in. This has to be a wet signature just to prevent, any instances of fraud or something like that. So the name of the person and that it would actually sign it. If you cannot, say they're living in Florida, they're retired, and you cannot get their wet signature, it is okay for them to take a picture of their real signature and, put it on the portion of the signature here. That's acceptable. Barring that, they can also sign another form that basically says the same thing here. They could write it out themselves on a piece of paper and just say, I managed the land since 2010, never put anything on it. Or I only put OMRI listed inputs on it, or I was certified organic, whatever it might be. So this is a really important part. Some people skip this and it will get held up in initial review if you do not have prior landowner signatures going back at least 3 years. More than 3 years, it's not going to matter. If it was 2017 or something or prior to that, you could list it on here if you feel the need, but we don't need to know about that. All right, that is everything on the C2. Take a quick pause before I go to C3 and say, if you ever want to add anything to your organic system plan as a supplement because you feel like these forms, you just can't write everything in there or you can't type everything in there, you can absolutely put supplements. Take a blank Word document or a blank piece of notebook paper and write, oh, I want you to know about these crops I did or these activities I did. So you can always add supplemental information that you think would matter to your reviewers for organic compliance. We love that sort of thing, and we will read every word of it, okay? All right, let's go on to C3 here. So, this one may not pertain to everyone, but certainly a lot of us. If you're planting any seeds, okay, you're definitely going to want to fill this out. Now, that would include folks who are doing cover crops in perennial systems. If I have a vineyard, for example, and I'm doing cover cropping and I'm only certifying the grapes to be organic, but I don't want to certify the cover crop as organic, per USDA NOP guidance, we definitely still need to know that you're following the same principles for seeds regarding that you're buying organic seed. And if you can't get organic, you're doing what's called a commercial availability search. You can get a hold of us if you don't know what that is, but basically you're checking with several seed suppliers and confirming you could not get organic in buckwheat. So you went with non-organic buckwheat, but you could demonstrate that it was non-GMO and non-treated. Those are both really important. Again, I'm just kind of glazing over a really important concept there, so get a hold of us if you're not familiar with organic seed searches and commercial availability. Happy we talk about it all day long. All that said, we'll walk through here and say, this form, really, folks, this is serving to make sure you know what the guidelines are around using organic seed, and that, okay, well, we're using organic seed, or if not, we do our seed here. And if I have treatments like alfalfa inoculum, that I'm listing those inoculums, because not every inoculum is necessarily going to be approved for use in organic. There might be some synthetic coating on there, so we'd want to review that kind of stuff, all right? There are cases where people are not using seeds and they still fill this out because maybe they're using perennial planting stock. So this C3 serves as a way of us getting to know you and what your activities are, and make sure that all your activities around seeds, nursery stock, making your own cuttings, whatever it might be, are compliant. This one's all pretty straightforward. I do not have a lot of applicants that I work with have a ton of questions on this form. Their questions are more around the regulations that spawned this form in the first place. So they say, well, what is commercial availability? And again, we have a wonderful resource on our website about it. You could search Oregon Tilth commercial availability for seeds, and you can see that resource, or maybe it can pop up on the bottom of the screen here. Thanks to our marketing comm team. All right. So I'll go down here, and this one goes pretty quick. I'm checking boxes. I'm explaining where I maybe think additional information is necessary. How do we determine organic cedar planting stock is not available for equivalent varieties? Well, that's calling around to at least 3 different seed suppliers, or if not calling, emailing's fine. Just some sort of documentation that you put a good faith effort to get a hold of at least 3 seed suppliers and determine whether you could get organic or not. Just to be clear, if it just is too expensive, and I get some organic seed can be expensive, some is the same price as non-organic, but that's not a barrier, unfortunately, in terms of compliance. So if you find organic and it's more expensive, you still technically, to satisfy NOP guidelines, would have to use that seed, okay? Just to be aware. Now, the seed treatments, genetic modification. I mean, one thing to be aware of, if you're using a crop that is not available commercially as GMO, so let me look out the window, blueberries, for example. So my blueberries, I can't go to any wholesale nursery and buy GMO blueberries. I mean, they might exist in a lab, but they're not commercially available. So there's a lot of crops that you do not necessarily have to have the GMO statement for. However, when you get a hold of your seed supplier, Johnny's or High Mowing, Territorial, whoever the seed supplier is, they're so used to working with organic growers that they can provide confirmation that the seeds you bought from them are non-GMO and non-treated. It will probably be just a single letter even if you buy 100 seeds. So they'll look at your order and say, none of these are GMO, none of these are treated. And most of you folks know this, but just in case anyone watching is not familiar, seed treatments, one simple way to tell if it's treated with something prohibited is if it's a real weird color, like I see bright pink, bright blue. Those are the most common ones. That means that there's usually a fungicide, so to prevent sort of rotting or dampening off of the seed. However, it's possible there'd be a seed treatment that doesn't have that bright color, so it still is really important to get some sort of affirmation from the seed supplier that it's not treated. And like I said earlier, it could be an inoculum for a legume, or some sort of coating on the seed that doesn't have that bright blue or pink appearance, but still may or may not be prohibited. At the end of the day, we still have to review it, no matter what, if it's some sort of treatment here. So just important to be aware of. All this is to say, we want to be sure you don't go and plant treated seed on your land, especially as you're getting ready to become organic, because that planting of organic seed would be counted as a prohibited substance application in those areas. And man, if I've seen some heartbreaking cases, someone goes out and plants a bunch of squash. That's a really common one because squash is often treated. And they said, well, I didn't really look at the seed, but I know it was bright pink. So that land then suddenly has to restart the 3-year clock. We really want you to help you avoid that situation so you don't have to start over again. Okay, please get a hold of us with any questions. All right, so let's move on to C4 here. This one's relatively straightforward, and a lot of you folks with farming backgrounds watching would hopefully have some fun with this one. It's a lot of check boxes asking about your practices for managing soil health, okay, and managing the fertility of your crops. Basically, what sort of tillage practice do you use? Some of you don't use any. And cultivation, we include mowing, weeding in there. I mean, almost everyone's going to put something in that question. And then what are some practices to actually, this is right in line with organic principles, protect the soil, minimize erosion? Some folks kind of gloss over this section and say, I don't know what it matters, but this is important this is foundational organic information. So we would want to know, are you doing anything to try to protect the soil? And you may be doing some of these things and not even realize it. You may well have windbreaks already on the side of your fields. All this is to say, my friendly encouragement is whatever you check on here, be sure that when your inspector comes out, you can explain what those are. So some folks, well-meaning, say, well, I don't have any windbreaks, I don't have cover crops, I don't do strip cropping, but I want to do that in 5 years from now, so I'm just going to check them because they sound cool. It creates a little bit of an issue because when your inspector comes out or your initial review team looks it over and says, oh, this is great, you're doing all this, can you tell me about it? You say, well, I'm not actually doing it. So that's all to say, just for your sake, be honest about what you plan to do, at least in this forthcoming year, the year you're applying for organic certification. And if you're not doing any of this stuff, we can talk about it. There probably will be a plan for improvement going forward. Crop rotations, these are foundational to organic certification, okay? If you say, well, I'm just growing corn and I do it year after year, you'll very likely need to integrate some sort of legume or something in your rotation to mix it up, all right? Now, we fully recognize that if you have hazelnuts or some other perennial crop system, blueberries, that a rotation may not be possible, okay? So it's where possible, what is your crop rotation? And in those perennial systems, maybe you have room to cover crop or something to increase biodiversity, all right? And a few questions about manure, pretty straightforward. If you have any specific questions on manure, we're glad to address them. One big thing I would draw your attention to is number 4. So it's talking about incorporating manure or just spreading it and not incorporating it. These day ranges, 90 days or 120 days, are really food safety guidelines. What happens is if I go out and spread uncomposted manure on let's say my lettuce crop or nearby my lettuce crop, I probably don't want to harvest that in 2 weeks because the risk of E. coli contamination is pretty high, and we've all seen that in the news, these big recalls. Now, granted, it's usually not small farms that are going to run into that issue. It's usually much, much larger operations, and who knows if it even came from the field, by the way, but that's, argument for another day. All that said, if you are applying manure, you want to wait at least 90 days for crops that are edible portions or off the ground. So plums, I've got plums up in the air behind me. If I spread manure, I've got to wait at least 90 days or 120 days before harvest. If it's crops that are on the ground, it might actually contact the soil. Compost. This comes up a fair amount if you're making it on farm or if you're purchasing it. We'll want to know about it. We'll want to review it. It generally does not create compliance issues as long as it's just good old-fashioned compost. You do not have to use something that's certified organic. Compost is not certified organic, okay? It might come from a certified organic farm. It may have certified organic inputs, but it does not have to. Okay, this is a common point of misconception. The compost can be produced using non-certified feedstocks. It could be produced using scraps from the table as long as it's properly composted, okay? And if you want some guidelines about how to make your compost to satisfy National Organic Program requirements, they're right here. So I want to make sure my compost reaches at least 131 degrees for at least about 15 days, and we turn it in there a lot during that 15-day period, okay? Or maybe I'm doing a static system where I just want to document it gets to 131 to 170 for at least 3 days. And the way to test that is super simple. You can take any sort of thermometer. I like to use an infrared one I have it from auto stuff. It works great. It's fun with the little laser. So the infrared one, you can open up the compost, shine it in there, document what the temperature was one day, do it the next 2 days. I geek out and do it more than that because it's interesting. But to satisfy compliance, just at least 3 days. If you don't have an infrared, you could use a probe that's just a metal one, and it shows you the approximate temp. If you have to round to 5 degrees, it's fine. Just make sure it's above 131 Fahrenheit, okay? Glad to talk more about compost. There's some great resources, and I could send you a really cool ATRA publication about compost if need be. All right, micronutrients. Oh, this is a big one. So for micronutrients, folks, I get this question a lot, but can I apply them? Yes. Can I just apply them willy-nilly? No, probably not with organic. Where micronutrients can be applied, and I'm talking about synthetic micronutrients or often synthetic sources micronutrients, where they can be applied is situations where you can document a deficiency in the plants or in your crops. So I go take petiole tests in my, let's say, table grapes, and sure enough, there's a zinc deficiency, and I can, send it to a lab and actually see that there's a deficiency, or an agronomist does it on my behalf, and they recommend some amount of zinc be applied, and maybe that product's synthetic. As long as I have that documentation, then I can apply it. If I go out and just look at the table grapes and I say, well, it looks like a zinc deficiency, so I'm going to spray, some sort of zinc product on them or apply it to the soil, that may not be compliant, okay? Because I've just looked at them and visually said, well, I think it's a zinc deficiency. That's not enough. So we need some sort of test in there to determine it is. And finally, there's some questions on monitoring. Do you get out of the truck and actually look at your crop and look at the soil and assess how it's healthy or what may be lacking? What sort of things are you doing? And if you're not doing any of these, that's okay. But we may, going forward, encourage you to do them in order to get a better idea of your practices and how they relate to nutrient cycling and responsible organic management of nutrients in the soil ecosystem. Okay. Great, that is C4. I'm going to pause it here and take a little break. When I jump back in, you might see a different level of daylight in the room, but that'll make it all the more fun. So I'll be back. Thanks, folks. All right, folks, we're back after a brief intermission there. So we are on one of our simplest and most straightforward parts of the application, which is the pest, disease, and weed management. Certainly all of you deal with these to some degree. Thankfully, the organic approach, in essence, is all about integrated pest management. So we're looking to use many little hammers as opposed to one big hammer. In other words, one synthetic fungicide or something to manage our diseases or pests or what have you. All we're looking for here at the very beginning, and I will go through this one pretty quickly because it is so straightforward, which is nice for a break. What we're looking for here is just what are the major pests that threaten your crops. So out here in the Pacific Northwest, I might list brown marmorated stink bug, powdery mildew, botrytis, and the list goes on. And then what am I doing to help manage those pests? Anything from, well, I manage nutrients carefully. I'm not putting too much nitrogen on, and times when those could exacerbate the pests. And what are you actually using now or plan to use this coming season? And then are you actually using materials? In other words, some sort of spray like pyrethrin. There's a whole host of things. Are you using any materials? There are folks who do not use any sort of input for that, but most of us do. All right. And then just how do you decide when to use them? Are you just using preventative measures like I spray pyrethrin once a week to keep ahead of mite damage or something? Or are we actually waiting till we see a certain economic threshold, like a certain amount of damage on my crops before I'm going to apply these substances? And just asking about plastic mulch, landscape fabric, other barriers. This is real straightforward stuff. The main thing here is that later in the application on the C11, we'll list out the different inputs we use and what we use them for. And so just be sure that you're going to list them later if they're being used in your organic areas. All right. Some of us burn crop residue, perhaps. That's fairly typical with orchard crops after pruning time to eradicate especially woody tissue that might be infected with something like bacterial canker or whatever it might be. So if you do engage in burning, we'll want to discuss that a little. And again, for all of this, folks, don't worry about a wrong answer that would disqualify you from certification. It doesn't quite work that way. It's a friendly reminder that if there's a practice you're using that's out of compliance, we'll work with you. We'll identify what it is and say, well, this practice isn't compliant with USDA National Organic Program standards, but we'll work with you to find some compliant path forward. Okay. And then how are you actually monitoring that, whether or not your pest management program is working? So a little bit about that is really helpful. I know it's tempting to just rip through this form and check boxes, but if you're able to describe a little bit about what you do, even a sentence or two, that will go a long way during your review and your inspection, because again, all of this is just to ensure ahead of time, as ideally during initial review at the beginning of your application review, to ensure that you're compliant or close to it before we even schedule inspection. So that way you're all but guaranteed to pass inspection, as it were. Or in other words, your inspector comes out and finds very few, if any, non-compliances or points of improvement. All right. That's as much as we need to go on that form. I'm not going to have to or make it more complicated than it is. Let's move on. This one, for some folks, I understand, is a little bit esoteric, but it is certainly one of the fundamentals of organic certification, and that's natural resources, biodiversity. These might be kind of new concepts. We certainly have applicants who look at this and go, I don't know what the heck this is talking about, which is a good motivator to read up on it a bit. There's some NOP guidance here called out in the form in 5020. There's a couple, they point to the rules here in 205-200. You could read over those, or you could talk to us, look at our website. If you need to brush up on this a little, we're happy to help because it is pretty important. Do you have a conservation plan? Some of our applicants are actually already working with the NRCS. We have people at Tilth that are in coordination with the NRCS, and so we maintain a pretty tight relationship with them. And then we have other, partnerships here, Soil Conservation District, Land Trust, all these sort of things where, maybe you have a management program for your natural resources, which, by the way, it does not have to be something like, thousands of acres of wetland. It can be, I've got, say, an acre. Let's just take an acre. And if you have a stream running through or adjacent to your acreage, what are you doing to ensure that stream is not contaminated with, a ton of runoff from your organic fertilizers? Because, that still could be a problem if you're over fertilizing and it's contaminating perhaps trout or salmon spawning habitat or something like that. So we just want to get a picture of how you're managing your water for your crops and any riparian ecosystems. Fancy way of just saying, is there a river or wetland nearby or something like that? Okay. And then moving down to number 3, in non-crop fallow border prairie adjacent areas, how are you improving or maintaining natural resources? You might be doing more than you think already. You might have fences that are friendly to wildlife, in other words, not barbed wire, or fences that allow certain wildlife like elk to still jump over it. Whatever it may be, these are just some of the ideas we'll use, and feel free to run with it. If there's more than you see on check boxes here, you could check other and describe to us what you're doing, because we will read it all and take it into consideration as part of your whole plan for not just protecting natural resources and biodiversity, but perhaps enhancing it is the idea here. Some of our folks are enrolled in a program called Be Better, where they're actually encouraging and supporting pollinator habitat. Now, that does not just mean honeybees. It's mason bees, bumblebees, and all these really important pollinators that are under threat because of a lot of different factors in the world today. So we have this Be Better certification. If you're interested, get a hold of us. But by no means are you required to get that. It's just a little pitch for it here. Well, are you doing anything on your farm currently to support those pollinators' habitat? Again, a bunch of different ideas. And if you're interested in, maybe you don't already have bat boxes on your farm now, but it's something you're interested in creating, we'll be happy to talk to you about strategies for that. But that's just one example. Or planting cover crops for floral resources for your pollinators. What are some of the actions you take to prevent or control invasive plants? Probably most of you are up on that. You see tansy out in your pastures, and you really don't want your cattle to be eating tansy. So what are you doing to control it? If you restrict wildlife from entering your production areas, and that's certainly understandable. My whole place is deer fence, certainly, or we wouldn't have food crops. So what are you doing to allow those wildlife to get through some other way, if you're doing anything at all? And then how are you monitoring biodiversity, or there's space for additional measures? You can really run with this, but again, my friendly insider encouragement, just be sure to list things you are actually doing or plan to do in the coming year. Because if you just check a ton of boxes because they all sound cool, that would come up during review or inspection as, what's actually implemented here? So that's enough on that one. Again, C5, C6 are a nice little break in the middle of application in terms of simplicity. All right, let's now get back into more logistics. We're going to do C7 here. C7 is about harvest, processing, storage, and transport. Okay, so if you have a facility on your farm that is used for some sort of, it can be as simple as a corn crib or a bin that you're storing grain in. It could be something perhaps like a wash station that's a shed out on the farm, so you're bringing produce there, diverse vegetables that you're washing or packing in the pack shed. Maybe it's a cooler on your orchard to store apples or something. Whatever it is, it's good to know about these facilities and whether they're actually on your farm or off the farm. Now, if they're off the farm, we'd we'd have to review it unless it's already been, I'd just say very likely, because perhaps that facility that's off the farm was reviewed by either us or another certifier and is already organic. But if not, we definitely need to know about it. We've seen some of our clients, well-meaning, get into trouble because in terms of compliance, because they use the neighbor's corn crib and it's literally just across the street from them. And they said, I just got in a pinch and had, a bumper crop this year and wanted to store grain. So I just dumped it in their crib. And it wasn't inspected at the time they did that. That could jeopardize the compliance. In other words, the organic status of the crop, and you may not be able to sell that as organic. So be sure any area that's going to contain organic products and organic crops, be sure it's inspected or listed on your organic system plan, whether it's on your farm or on a neighbor's farm. Okay, so there's some spaces here to list the facility and kind of talk about what you're doing there: washing, sorting, mixing, drying, blending, all kinds of things. And we want to get a very simple picture. Again, this can be like your farm map. You can hand draw it. You can take a picture of it. You could do it digitally, whatever works for you. All right, it does not need to be complicated. In fact, we're happy if it's simple, and just show what's being done there. Here's, I might show a table, and this is the table, stainless steel that we pack on. There's a sink over here. We receive produce. You could show an arrow of here's where my farm team comes in. They drop all the stuff off here. It's washed, it's packed, it's brought to the cooler. So a little bit of a flow using arrows about how product moves through the facility. And then asking about some of the post-harvest handling. So what do you do once the crop's actually been cut or harvested? Plenty of these activities, by the way, are covered by your crop certification. Some folks think that something as simple as drying would require handling certification. Thankfully, it does not. The National Organic Program allows a lot of on-farm processing to occur under your crop certification, provided it's for only products that are grown on your farm. So if you're doing something for the neighbors, even just a little bit, we would definitely need you to have handling scope if that is to be sold as organic. So the neighbors bring over some apples. They say, well, I'll just throw them in with your organic apples. Big no-no in terms of compliance. We would need to have you have handling certification if that's intended to be sold as organic. All right. And even, frankly, if not, if you're still processing the neighbor's apples, even just storing them in a cooler, you definitely want to be upfront about that, because you'd hate for the inspector to be surprised when they came out, or even your review team to be surprised and say, whoa, you're storing the neighbor's apples. That would be a point of contamination. Maybe the neighbor's apples would get mixed up with yours and create some compliance issues. So just be upfront about it, and we'll be happy to help ensure that you have a system in place to keep those segregated and protect your organic crop. Do any processed products include ingredients from off-farm? So this is where, let's take the example of dilly beans. That's one I like to make this time of year. If I'm making dilly beans, I grow the green beans here, and I'm going to put them in mason jars with some wonderful brine and pickle. I have a bunch of pickling spices, some really hot chili peppers I grew on the farm, but I'm using vinegar that I bought, down at the store. So that vinegar that I bought at the store is an off-farm ingredient. All right. The only thing would be salt. You could bring salt in. You could make a product with salt, but I mean, if you're bringing anything else from off farm, and you're making a multi-ingredient product or something similar, that's going to require handling certification. All right. And like I said earlier, if you're processing non-organic products at the facility, actually processing them, you might need organic handling certification. All right. So with commingling prevention, this is pretty big. If you have this handling area and this equipment and you're using it for organic product and non-organic, there's kind of two ways this can look. One of them is I've got apples that are organic and I've got apples that are non-organic. That's as understandably pretty high risk, because what measures do I have in place to ensure that my organic apples do not get mixed up with my non-organic apples? They look pretty similar. It's easy to think, one of our family members or hired hands working the farm might be kind of bleary-eyed one morning and then suddenly mix the Granny Smiths up because, they all look the same. Who's going to know the difference? So it is much higher risk if you have organic and non-organic of the exact same crop, especially the same variety. If you're dealing with organic apples and non-organic, let's say avocados for fun, pretty low risk of contamination there. I mean, there's still some concerns. We would need to know about it, but much less of a risk of them getting contaminated, and no one would know about it because they look, night and day different, apples to avocados, as it were. All right. So for our sanitation and water use, this one comes up a fair amount actually, because folks are like, well, I'm using municipal water, which has chlorine in it. Is that a problem? No, that's not a problem generally. I mean, I'm using well water. Is that an issue? No, that's generally not an issue. If you were taking water out of an irrigation canal and washing your produce with it, that might be an issue for compliance, but you're probably not doing that for food safety reasons anyway. So we still want to get a picture of how you are cleaning your produce or your farm products, and then what you're doing to actually clean the equipment. We just want to be sure. You can use a ton of different cleaners. They don't have to be certified organic cleaners. In fact, that's hard to find. They exist. They do not have to even necessarily all be OMRI, listed, or something like that. But we still need to know about what cleaners you're using and how you're using them. And so you can just tell your team at Tilth, here are my cleaners. You can list them on the inputs list or something like that. And we do make space for standard operating procedures. Most of you are familiar with the acronym SOPs. So that can be as simple as one sentence that just says, we clean our stainless steel tables with Dawn soap and water, and we rinse it off until there's no soap residue. That's an SOP for cleaning your food contact surfaces. You could describe it in here. I personally, there's no way, given cleaning activities we do here, there's no way I could fit our SOP onto here. However, ours are still pretty darn simple, all right? Where I can describe probably on one Word document, a couple paragraphs about all the cleaning of tools, all the cleaning of any food contact surfaces that we'll do. And most of this is specifically talking about food contact surfaces. I guess I should not have given the example of tools, or maybe that was too general, because what you do in the farm field is a little different than here. We could talk about that later, but for food contact surfaces, there are some restrictions on what you can use to clean those areas. One of the most problematic compounds are called quaternary ammonias. That's quats for short. A lot of the farmers I know do not use quats, or maybe haven't even heard of them, so not a worry. But if you are using quaternary ammonia, talk to us about it. There is a way to use it, but it's complicated, so you might want to find an alternative. But if you have to use it, we can talk to you about it and what the restrictions are. All right? And identify how you ensure that contact surfaces are free of residue. So this one's a little bit common sense. Some of these are so simple that you kind of squint your eyes and say they must be asking more, but they really are. We do still need to know, despite how simple they are. If you're using something like chlorine materials, like bleach, that's great, super common, absolutely allowed as long as it's within, as long as that chlorine material does not have a bunch of other weird compounds in it, like if it was chlorine and mixed with a bunch of other soaps or something. I mean, we would still need to know what you're using, but there's usually a rinse step if it's a soap to get all the residue off, or for cleaning products that evaporate, like alcohol-based products, you just want to ensure that there's no, leftover isopropyl on the table when you start processing food. Again, I know it sounds common sense, but we still need to have that clear in this organic system plan. So that should be pretty straightforward for you. How do you document your cleaning sanitation? This is one some of us gloss over, and one really easy way to take care of it is a cleaning sanitation log. This is important. You could have something like a clipboard in the pack house, and when someone comes in the morning, they say, okay, 6 a.m., I went over, wiped everything down, and initial, good to go. That's an auditable record. Say, because it's a piece of paper in the pack house that says the date and time, or whatever, that they cleaned the tables and that it was done. An example of a record that is not auditable would be in Levi's head. Okay, if I say, well, I know I clean it every morning, why wouldn't I? that's just me telling the inspector or the reviewer that I did it, and that's not technically an auditable record. So you can have it in an app on your phone. You can have it in some sort of cleaning log, like I said, just something that is a physical record that could be audited if needed. All right, this stuff's all pretty straightforward. Are you using water in direct contact with organic product? Where is this coming from? We just want to be sure that you're using water that's not going to prevent or provide any source of contamination. For almost all of our applicants, this is not a big issue, but occasionally some of us are out in the boondocks, the wonderful, wonderful boondocks where it's quiet, and we may be using big tanks of rainwater we collect or something. And it's like, well, how are you monitoring that is clean or free of prohibited substances? Okay. Those of you that have a water master or part of an irrigation district, that irrigation district is, we would assume, monitoring the status of the water. And if they do something like treat it with an algicide, what we hope is that you'd be in communication with them and know that they're either going to treat it or have treated it, so we can document this, because some of those algicides are synthetic compounds. So if that's a concern, please talk to us about it. If you're chlorinating your own water to disinfect it, that can be done, that's fine, but there is a very clear upper limit of free chlorine in there, 4 parts per million. So that's something that needs to be monitored with something as simple as test strips or pens, they're called. There's something that shows you're actively monitoring the amount of chlorine in there and not just saying, well, I dumped some in until it smells clean. Don't laugh, you'd be amazed at some of the things we see in here. All right, getting down there. Storage facility practices. This is big, okay? Are you storing crops? And if you are storing them, where is it at? What's it stored? If you feel like this little table is too constraining and you can't fit all the info on, please feel free to start a new Word document or a new notebook paper and tell us about the storage facility, where it's at, the products there. And is this OC is certified organic? If it is, be sure to provide a certificate that has that, facility or that farm listed on there. Is it independent storage? We have a separate sheet for that. Or is it something that you own and it's either on the farm or perhaps off, and it says, on-site locations are included here. If you own it or lease it, that's great, that's fine, but we likely will need to inspect it if it hasn't been inspected already, right? And it gives instructions down here, so be sure to attach that organic certificate or we'll have to ask for it later. That might extend your review time. We can provide you with the independent storage information sheet if it's not certified organic, but you're just storing, let's say, bulk product. There are cases where you might have farm products that are eventually stored somewhere and they're in sealed containers, for example. They can be stored in a non-inspected, non-certified facility if they're all sealed up, but there's a lot of rules around that, so we'll help you navigate it. But kind of let us know the picture of how you're storing things, and we'll work with you to make sure nothing ends up being stored in a location in such a manner that it's going to lose its organic status. That is what we are working really hard with you to avoid. It occasionally happens. It's usually because someone well-meaning just didn't know that they had to have their potatoes stored in an inspected facility. And we understand the thinking there, but we really want to protect your crop at the end of the day so you can still sell it as organic and get those premiums. All right, finally, the off-site processing and handling. Now, this is, are you doing any sort of processing off-site, and are you working with a co-packer or maybe another neighboring farm? Oh, let's take the example of hazelnuts, for example. So I get my hazelnuts harvested, get them all vacuumed off the orchard floor, and I'll bring them somewhere to be sorted and cleaned and washed, perhaps, and all that goes into it. So where's it going? Is that person certified organic, or what kind of claims will be made? What's happening downstream? And again, this is just to ensure that your product through the supply chain is going to follow a compliant path all the way to the consumer that ultimately buys it. Some of this is out of your jurisdiction, your purview. The onus is not necessarily on you to make sure that these entities downstream are certified, but for your sake, to ensure that you can keep selling organic, we just want to be sure that the next person in line for custody of your crop is certified if they need to be. All right. So let's ask about attaching a valid certificate for processing facilities. A lot of our farms do something where they'll send the, let's say, hazelnuts again to a processor. So they take them off their farm, they'll sell them, and then they'll get them back in the end. They maybe get them back in package form with a label on it, and they're roasted. So we just want to be sure that the person or the business you're selling to has current organic certification for your protection. You know, someone might tell you they do. Be sure to get their current is the key word, organic certificate. And when I say current, I mean within about 18 months ago it was issued. If you get an organic certificate that's 5 years old, might be worth asking us to check for you if it's actually current. We'd be happy to help. All right. I think that's enough about harvest, storage, transport. This is a really important form. Some folks skip it because they say, well, you know, I just sell it out of the field. That might, if you actually have someone custom harvest and kind of buy it at the point of harvest, you may not have to do this, but still a lot of cases we find that there's some storage taking place or some sort of cleaning. So it really is worth completing at least the sections of this form that you think might pertain to you. All right, let's move on to labeling and sales. Here's another one a lot of folks, I think understandably, skip. And, you know, they say, well, I'm just dealing with whole grains or something like that, so I'm not labeling. But it's really worth giving this form a look and seeing if it pertains to you. And you could even just try to fill out some of the sections that pertain. So for non-retail shipping or storage containers, and this is bulk, by the way, you know, are you doing something like even using old cardboard boxes and moving the diverse vegetables you got from you have a CSA, for example, and you're moving boxes to your customers in these, you know, non-retail containers. What does that look like? How do we ensure that anything organic is clearly marked, or what sort of identification system do you have? Does it say organic? Do you have a lot number on it? Just some system for tracking all this, okay? Some of our farms are they actually print their own retail package labels, so they'll actually have a printer and they'll be sticking labels on. We do want to see what these labels look like and make sure that any claims on them are compliant. And again, that's just to protect you. So you're not making claims that are non-compliant and might, you know, risk having to print out thousands and thousands more labels. Because we all know the cost of labels these days and the time it takes to make them. Please always send labels to us before you send them to the printers, because then we can review them and we can approve them and tell you, all right, you're good to go. You can send these to the printers and you can rest assured that these are compliant. We have seen heartbreaking cases where people print 10,000 beautiful, intricate labels at quite a cost, you know, maybe a couple bucks a label in some cases. And only to find out that these labels had one little claim on them, or the USDA seal was kind of funky. They decided to use tie-dye or something. At the end of the day, that label is non-compliant and they had to basically throw them away, okay? You can't return them to the printer, of course. So we really want you to avoid a scenario like that. All right, just a bit more about the labels there. And this table is all about any products you might be packing for others. If you're doing some sort of co-packing, we'd want to know about it. Likely this will fall into the realm of handling, but you know, we'll see what the product is, who you're packing for, if there's a private label agreement, kind of how you're packing for them, and what that will look like downstream. Some folks end up doing what's called a product formulation sheet if you're making multi-ingredient products like pickles or something. And then if you are packing for different brand owners, so it might be as simple as, well, I pack some of my neighbor's apples and they have a private label on it, like, you know, XYZ Farms. And so I'm doing that for them. At the end of the day, our farm just puts a label on and kind of ships them. We definitely would want to know about that. Packaging container. This one is interesting because some folks think this is really, really important and make or break the packaging containers. Some folks gloss over and think, why would it matter? They're just plastic totes. And the truth's somewhere in between. I mean, mostly there's almost everything under the sun for packaging you can use. The one thing that's problematic are cardboard boxes that have been impregnated with fungicide. I know that might sound weird, but in the produce industry, it's somewhat common for certain vegetables and fruits to be in these shipping containers or these boxes that have actual fungicide in the paraffin wax or in the coating to prevent, spoilage during shipping. So we do want to look at it and make sure that what you're packing it into is compliant. It's very likely going to be fine. And finally, there's some stuff about international labeling if you are doing any exporting from the United States. If you're not doing any, you can just skip this and move on to C9. If you're doing some, we'll work with you and make sure that this exporting is compliant. Even if it's Canada or Mexico, we definitely will need to gather more information. You might need to apply for another scope. So get a hold of us. We have a whole team of folks who are really seasoned in doing export documentation, what are called transaction certificates. But that's a webinar for another time, all right? Just know that we have a team of folks here that can serve you if this applies. Great. Let's move on to C9, contamination prevention. All right. So when folks hear the word contamination, I think what most often comes to mind is contamination with synthetic fungicides, synthetic, some sort of pesticide. And they think, well, okay, I'm not going to get any of that stuff because I only do organic produce and I only have organic inputs on the shelf. But the other part of contamination is contamination of your organic product with non-organic product. Okay, that's one people don't think about as much. And we have a lot of farms who split or parallel production, and that might be more of an issue for folks who are doing both. So we just want to be sure here, what does it look like in terms of your processing equipment? That whole picture of if you're sharing equipment, which is really common for farms of any scale, that can be done. We have tons of people who share blueberry harvesters or who share, even something as simple as tables. Like, oh yeah, we've got folding tables and we use them and the neighbor uses them. So we want to kind of get a picture of what equipment might be shared, if the other operation that you're sharing with is certified organic or not, and then what you're doing to ensure it's clean. Another big one that comes up is tillage equipment and weed control equipment. So if I bring the neighbor's Kubota over and I rototill my land here, if the neighbor is not certified organic and I bring it over and there's soil all over, and honestly, even if they are certified organic, it's not terribly good practice to just bring a rototiller from another field and just willy-nilly till a bunch of nematodes or something into my field. What we're looking for here is that, are you taking appropriate and thorough cleaning measures? Now, you don't have to get down with a toothbrush, thank goodness, and scrub the rototiller. We're reasonable about it. They're practical. For some equipment, power washing is great to remove soil. That's completely compliant. If you say I power washed it, I know that cleaned everything off, and the neighboring field was certified organic anyway, that's low risk. If I borrow some equipment that you cannot power wash, or the neighbor says you can't power wash it, that's fine. There's other ways forward. A lot of people use compressed air and blow it out. Barring that, another thing folks do will say I have an auger that is being used for grain, and that auger has some conventional corn in it. Well, what I can do there is run organic through, and I'll do whatever, a bushel or some arbitrary amount that I know is enough to purge the non-organic grain that's in there. There's not a magic number. It's up to you to observe that and say, okay, well, I had non-organic grain in there. I ran X amount through of organic, which I sacrificed, so to speak, or I sold as conventional. in order to just clean this, purge it out thoroughly. All right, so we'll work with you on that. Water use, again, this is coming back to, do you irrigate? Is there a potential for any sort of contamination from your water? You know, if you're in a municipal system, it's probably fairly low. If you're using it out of a pond on the property that borders a neighbor's property, and that neighbor's using, you know, synthetic fertilizers near the pond, that might be a higher potential for contamination and might require some testing of the water to affirm that it's free of prohibited substances. So this is the point of discussion. This is kind of how we get a picture of it, and we'll ask follow-up questions as needed. All right, I think that's enough here. I mean, you may need to, in some cases, have a plan for monitoring them. And in some cases you won't, because you say, well, I'm just using municipal water or something like that. And, you know, that's monitored by the city. And the onus is to some degree on the city in that case to make sure that it's not full of ammonium nitrate or something. God forbid. All right. On the borders of my property, this is a big one. I know we talked about this on C2 and your buffers, but we're bringing it up here again just to ensure, because it's so important. Is there any risk of prohibited materials drifting from the neighbor onto your organic land? And that's drift from anything like, I mean, actually floodwater. In the case of I get a big rain and it sheets across my field or my neighbor's field onto my land, is that going to bring prohibited substances on? Or like we gave the example of big boom sprayers or big air blast sprayers, and maybe the neighbor's a real cowboy and doesn't care about wind speed when he sprays, and it drifts all over your land. So, I mean, there's only so much we can do about this. Hopefully you have a good relationship with the neighbors. You can let them know you're organic. Maybe they're willing to work with you on their practices. Maybe they don't want to speak to you, or they roll their eyes. Whatever the case may be, the point of this is to protect your organic crop. All right. And that might be putting a real big buffer in between you and the neighbor to make sure that no spray gets over. I guess I should mention, there are a lot of the folks I talk to on the phone are not aware of spray cards. It's a wonderful tool you can get for very cheap from any farm co-op, or I'll say online in a general sense. And spray cards, they're usually yellow, some bright color, and you hang them up in the orchard, or you hang them just on your farm fields, and they'll react when there's water droplets applied to them. I've used them before. They're really quite cool. So what you can do is hang them up, and then your neighbor goes and sprays, and you say, all right, he sprayed the way he always does, cowboy as he is, and these cards were 100 feet away, and they do not have any evidence of drift. There's no droplets on here. That's an auditable record that you monitored your neighbor's spray practices and you determined it didn't drift over and that your buffer is sufficient. So wonderful tool, highly encourage it. Now, those might not be pertinent if your neighbor's just applying by only a backpack sprayer and they're using a little wand and keeping it on the ground. So, I mean, probably those spray cards are only important with high drift incidents or technologies. Okay. Oh, public roads. Yeah, I'm by a public road, and you can put no spray signs. Sometimes the blackberries just grow over them. I think they do it intentionally to hide the no spray sign. Wait, that wouldn't make sense. They just grow over everything anyway. But the no spray signs are a nice tool. They do help. They let the county know, but much better to communicate directly with the county if you can, or at least be aware of what they're doing. I mean, our road here went from spraying at one time to mowing physical. So that was great because then there's no risk of drift. But you get tree crews that come in and they do their thing. And usually they're pretty, I mean, in my experience, the tree crews are respectful. They ask about spraying anything, at least on your property, thank goodness, but maybe even near. And you can let them know you're certified organic, and that would jeopardize the compliance of your crop. Okay. We get a lot of folks that reach out to their county and the roadside managers and, you know, have an understanding. And, you know, it might still happen that someone goes by and they're not paying attention and they spray. Just let us know if that happens. It's not your fault. It may still affect your crop, and we'll work with you to mitigate the damage, meaning try to segregate that crop that did get sprayed, ensure that it does not get mixed with the rest of your crop. and end up, jeopardizing the organic status of your entire harvest. So we'll work with you in the event of someone from the road crew accidentally sprays or something. Treated lumber, I think, comes up in here. Yeah, this is one I guess I haven't talked about. So treated lumber, all that's to say is, here's the best way to think about it. If you can prevent your organic crops and organic land from having any contact with treated lumber, it's not really a big deal in terms of compliance to have it at the margins of your land, well away from where any crops or livestock would be. Livestock is a lot trickier, by the way, because they have 2 to 4 legs typically. And so they could walk up, brush up against a treated post. Very problematic. They could lose their status. Crops are a little easier to contain usually. I mean, some crops vine all over the place. So if you have a vineyard or a hop yard and there's treated posts at the end and they start twining up it, that suddenly is non-compliant because they're directly contacting treated wood. What a lot of our organic producers do is try to find alternatives to using treated posts at the end of the vineyard. If they can't do that, well, then they'll try to train their crops and ensure that it never makes contact. But it's something to be mindful of. Now, when we say treated lumber, we mean, pressure treated wood or something like that. Creosote, my goodness, railroad ties. If you, well-meaning, some of our folks say, well, I'll just wrap the posts in plastic or I will paint them and that will keep any of the copper arsenic from leaching off. I appreciate the innovative thinking there. That's great, but that generally doesn't fly because of how the wood will break down and leach. So the NOP is not going to allow you to simply just paint the posts and say, all right, there's no leaching. If you encase them in concrete at the bottom, that might be enough of a barrier that it would be allowed, but it really depends on the circumstance. If you can avoid the treated lumber altogether and find other alternatives such as plastic, metal, wood, other woods, something besides treated lumber in the future, that's going to be a lot more compliant moving forward. All right. And then split in parallel production. So are you simply producing non-organic crops and organic crops here? And then do they look the same? So again, the apples to avocados example. If I'm doing organic apples and non-organic avocados, low risk for contamination. If I'm doing organic apples and non-organic apples, is pretty high risk. What are you doing then if you have organic and non-organic apples? What is in place to ensure that someone coming from off the farm or someone working there that was not familiar with organic, they wouldn't come in and make a mistake. They wouldn't accidentally pick into the wrong bin. There's a ton of tactics people use. Some folks just harvest at separate dates. That's a great one. Say, okay, we do our organic apples on September 15th and our non-organic on September 30th. And, that's enough where we have crews of people that are led by contacts at the farm that are familiar with organic. Then provide a list of all the materials used in your non-organic production systems. So that's fine to have non-organic systems. It's fine, by the way, to have a shed that has, Roundup and crossbow and all those tools in the shed. You don't have to hide them during inspection, as some people think. But we just want to know what they are and how they're being kept separate so someone doesn't come in and make a mistake and apply that to organic land. And then finally, how do you identify and separate the materials listed above? Some folks use 2 separate chemical sheds or 2 separate cabinets or paint something on that. We've seen people put a skull and crossbones on the non-organic. You can get creative as long as everyone on the farm that's going to go in that shed and apply chemicals is clear on what the system is. It can't just be you do it and you know what it means, but one of your farm hands is not aware. All right, again, contamination is a really important one, or contamination prevention. So the C9, if you have questions on it, please work with my team on it because this is a big one for a lot of folks. All right, we're getting there. Let's go ahead and you'll notice there's no C10, just kind of for clarity. It might be confusing with C1, so we just go on to C11. C11 pretty straightforward. You're going to list anything in your organic production or plan, your OSP, that is either you're using right now or you intend to use this year. Now, some folks say, well, I don't know what I'm using yet this year. I'll figure it out later. That's fine. You can apply for tilth early in the year and add things as you go, but that will take a little more effort on your part to be emailing your team at tilth and adding them piecemeal. Ideally, you would add things here that you're likely to use, so then you have them approved, you know they're approved, and if they need to be reviewed, you're allowing several weeks for them to be reviewed. So you're not calling us and saying, man, I really need to spray for fire blight tomorrow. Can you review this like tonight? We'll do what we can to help you, especially if you're in like a real catastrophic situation where you have to medicate an animal or you have to control a disease that's exploded, but there's only so much our staff can do out of fairness to everyone else. So better to have a lot of arrows in your quiver. I like to look at it like that. And if the product, like I mentioned earlier, has been reviewed by either OMRI or WSDA, has a public list, then you can put it on here. And as long as you're using it within the way it's labeled for organic use, that will be compliant and you won't have to necessarily check with us. It's still not a bad idea to check, especially as you're new to organic, and say, well, can I use dolomite here for this purpose? Now, be really careful because you may go on the OMRI website and see that diatomaceous earth is approved for use in livestock. And you say, okay, well, it's used as a hoof treatment. So, I mean, certainly I can spray it on my crops. And diatomaceous earth, yeah, it's true, you can apply it to crops, but the restrictions may be different for crops than they are for livestock, or something may be approved for livestock or handling, but not approved for use in crops. Okay, so you have to use it within not just the label use, but also the organic guidelines and restrictions. Yeah, as thorough as you can be on this list up front will make your life downstream easier. Some of you folks may have an internal list already, like an Excel or some sort of spreadsheet that has all this stuff listed, and that's great, that's fine. You don't have to retype it here as long as that Excel file contains these same columns and same information. It can have more information, but you've got to have these key 4 columns in there. And so we're happy to accept that. Just if you do submit that, maybe write somewhere, I have attached my own list with this information. If you're coming from another certifier and you want to submit what you have on file with the other certifier, as long as it's current, that's acceptable. That's great by us. So if you're coming from, XYZ certifier, you can submit their version of the C11. We'll update it, but just give it a look over and make sure you're not submitting something that was out of your chemical cabinet 5 years ago, because you don't want to have it all cluttered here. All right. That's as simple as the C11 needs to be. I would call out labels or photos of containers are attached for each product that's not OMRI or WSDA. A lot of folks forget that. If there is a label, if you're using the neighbor's compost, we'll have to review that, but obviously that won't have a label. That's fine. But for products off the shelf that have a label that are not OMRI or WSDA, just snap a picture of the front label, and if there is one, a back label, and we'll review it or check. We may likely already have it reviewed internally, and we'll let you know if that is approved or not. Right, great. And finally, last but most certainly not least, so much of organic is about record keeping. So you may be at this is the cherry on top of your application, all right? Some folks get to this point and go, okay, I just want to be done. I get that feeling. But this is really important. So please, it's only 2 simple pages, but spend some time with it. What we're looking for here is an idea of what kind of records you're keeping. Am I keeping planting records that show when I'm putting a cover crop in and when I'm putting broccoli in? Am I actually writing down things like how my compost is made, what temperature it is? We want to see, again, auditable records, not in your head. They could be on the back of a notebook paper, or they can be on a barn wall, as long as it doesn't wash off or get scratched off. We've seen everything under the sun, as long as it's an auditable record. Ideally, it's something that these records are readily accessible at inspection. Otherwise, that inspector might have to run around with you to different barns to get different notebooks, and one of your relatives' handwriting is like mine and just indecipherable. If that is the circumstance, you may want to have some more centralized system where we say, okay, well, for inspection, we're sure to gather up all our notebooks, or we move to a system where we've got them all on a drive somewhere and we can access them simply from the comfort of the farm office. That's kind of an ideal scenario, is when you can access all the records in one place. That will help to keep your inspections shorter, more efficient, and thus it will cost less. I won't go through every one of these. Most of them you'll know if they apply, and you'll know if you're already keeping them. Again, some of you may not be keeping any of these, and that's okay to be honest, but you're going to have to keep something for sure. And let me draw your attention to one more thing. They should be sufficient to demonstrate compliance with organic standards and kept for at least 5 years. You do not have to have records from 5 years ago, okay? Big sigh of relief. You do need to start keeping your records and keep them on file for at least 5 years. So if 2028, my inspector comes out and says, all right, well, what were you doing back in 2023? You've got to be able to access it. After that, you can throw them through the shredder, but keep them on hand. And I mean, for other reasons, it's really nice to be able to look back, by the way. This is one of the silver linings of organic. When you start keeping all these records, I've found, for me, it does, as laborious as it can be to keep the records, it does make you a better farmer in the long run, hopefully. All right, and then how do we trace our records from sale through transport? It basically, can you show a picture of your organic product moving through the supply chain? What methods do you use to keep records? It's fine to use any of these, and if you have other ones, that's great. Computer software, I'll say one quick pitch there. Please do not feel like you have to get any fancy software, learn it for organic, and have your whole farm staff trained on whatever farm manager software. There's lots out there. There are some very good ones, but the learning curves can be steep. So we don't want people to get flustered and end up arriving at inspection and they don't even know how to navigate the software. If you're using a system of paper notebooks and that has worked for you for decades, great. We're all for it. Do you maintain? Yeah, we already talked about the 5 year. And then finally, non-organic crop production and organic, just asking about the split or parallel production again. And how are you sure that your records for organic are kept separate from your non-organic and you know which applies to which, so they don't, like the records don't get commingled, as it were, because it's easy enough to happen. All right, folks. Breathe a sigh of relief. We just walked through a whole crop OSP. It's hopefully relatively painless. My team exists to help you folks through this, okay? So if you are working through any of this stuff and you want some help with any section, we're glad to jump in with you. My friendly insider encouragement, this is what I'll leave you with, but my friendly encouragement to you, as someone who's walked through this before, just give it your best pass, the old college try. See what you could do, circle parts that don't make sense, and then come set up a meeting with Oregon Till. My team will meet with you. We can do Zoom if you prefer, or we can just talk on the phone and go over the parts that don't make sense and bring that to tip-top shape so you have an efficient review that goes quickly. You get on to inspection, you pass inspection with flying colors, so to speak, and then you get your organic certificate on a short as possible timeline. We want the best for you in the season. We want this to move through without any undue stress, and it really can. We've seen folks go just seamlessly through because they did a lot of groundwork on their OSP through this application. So my team, again, will do the get certified at tilth.org, and we should also do the phone number 541-201-8042. Please feel free to call or email, and we'll be happy to help you. All right, folks, thanks for listening, and it's good to see you all.